Okay. I'd like to welcome all our speakers back. Really, it's a bit of a panel debate. Based on the amount of conversation, discussion that's been going on outside the room, it sounds like there are a few things to talk about. We might run out, but who wants to start? If there are any particular questions, so ask of the panel. Come on, Lee.
Well, I was just going to throw the first one in, which was one proposed right at the very beginning. And is dimensions the right term for paper? And I know we have characteristics thrown up, facets of dimensions. So, kind of a poll of the room. What are the thoughts? The panel on the room.
So, if you want to start, probably the panel very quickly, we'll probably put a show of hands to see what people think. So, dimensions, is that the right word?
Yeah, one thing that I didn't mention in my presentation was that we've now got quite active involvement from a group of German specialists, and they are keen on the idea of dimensions. They're following more the Richard Wang MIT model, which is slightly more than 6. Yeah, quite a few more actually. But their view is that we would look to use that expression because we're not then talking about specifically a closed set of characteristics, a closed set of requirements, but they're more the starting point, so they're more like categories.
Okay, thank you.
Personally, I think it really depends on the organisation that you're working within and the kind of culture and the attitudes towards data quality. So I think I talked in my presentation about kind of data stewards and dimensions and key performance indicators and so on, but we never tended to really use that kind of terminology day to day because, to be honest, it didn't really quite have the credibility given the culture of the organisation. So we tend to talk more in terms of ownership of data and data checks rather than kind of dimensions and so on. So I think you've kind of got to tailor it to the problem set, really.
I think two good points. I can see the value of sticking to dimensions as opposed to say rules or data quality rules or metrics because as I showed, I think I showed the slide with Arcady Matrix framework. You can see how completeness actually breaks down into lots of different rules. So if you say we're going to call them rules, then you could definitely hit that problem. I think where do you stop? You go on and on and on. It's Arcadie's probably got the deepest set of rules. I think it just shows you how far you can go. But on the flip side, the big problem I found in the past is that you need to pick a term that is right for the business. Exactly what James says. I've used dimensions. I've used data quality rules, people use blankly. People in the team in your centre of excellence will get it, but actually it's just the right. So I think by all means, publicly call them metrics or KPIs when you're in a board meeting because they'll understand that because that's what they report when it's right. But when you're within your team, perhaps call them sort of dimensions because then you can get the theory across and train new people coming into the team. So I think it's the horses for courses thing again. Apply whichever one which works well for surrounding.
Not dimensions because they have no units. You can't say kilograms, meters, kilojoules. They have no units. You can't call them dimensions. You can't measure their proportion.
I agree with Dylan to a certain extent. I mean, the business are not going to understand those dimensions. That we need to convince them that we need to be measuring things, data quality, whatever. So, yeah, it's big characteristics. Or measurements, but something that's plain English that they will understand.
I think the issue is one largely of semantics. And a colleague of mine who's a data modeler once said you can put pepper in the salt cellar and salt in the pepper pots, those that's what salt and pepper mean. I think in many respects, whether it's the best word or not doesn't matter. It's probably the most commonly used term in the industry across all the discussions and the documents and the papers that I've seen. So on that basis, we should probably use it as the one that's most recognisable across the industry.
Picking up on Martin's point about measures, about units of measure, do you think that the dimensions actually could be the header term for a whole load of specific rules. They are the ones that have the actual measures and metrics. Is that a valid approach?
I would agree with that. I mean, as I alluded to in my talk earlier, I think dimensions are a way of thinking about the data to then drive out the rules. And the rules are associated with one or more dimensions. I guess you could call that a categorization of the rule in a way as well. But to me, it's a way of thinking about the data rather than a way of measuring the data.
Yeah. Views from the audience? Dimensions or not? Strong views either way?
Got a question. Given that we've all just pretty much said that the business doesn't understand dimensions itself and it's alienating, what's the benefit in having it?
I think it's a good summary, really, isn't it? I mean, that's the way that we use dimensions. So every time that we were building up rules and checks, we tried to relate them to a dimension. And occasionally we got into debates around, oh, is it a consistency or a completeness dimension? We didn't spend any more time than that considering it because, you know, ultimately we were just trying to present to senior stakeholders a rough indication of what's going on. Are things getting better? Are they getting worse? Is it worth having these people allocated to this project? And so on.
I think I can see the point in having whatever they're called, completeness and correctness, but if everybody's saying that no one except for us understands it, why do we keep the term that only we can understand?
I think you need to put a stake in the ground and have some term that classifies it. So the way I see it is like a bridge. Okay, so you have people who are deeply technical people who understand data quality rules and can apply all those kind of made-and-shipped, fine-grained data quality rules. Okay, but they might not necessarily understand what goes on at the board meetings. Okay, so you need this kind of bridge that transforms the low-level rules up to terms that the broader business understands. So things like completeness. You could walk into a room and say to a marketing manager, I've got some stats here on completeness, and they'll understand that. You know, in some of the forums I run, I see marketing manager type of people ask those type of questions. You don't need to get into the 7 different types of completeness rules, okay, so they understand that. You might phrase it slightly differently. You might say the completeness KPI or the completeness metrics. You don't have to talk about dimensions, but I think you need some kind of term that bridges both of those divides.
We'd have to stand in our corner and fight the cause, see how many people join our camp. I think we need a ubiquitous language that both the business and technology understand. If it's got the correct description, then we should use it. Everybody should understand it.
Will we ever get to that when finance is never going to be the same as healthcare or another type of industry, with their own little languages happening on top?
Correct. I tend to think we go with the adaptation, the translation.
Most of us, we do all speak the same language, but when you get to industry specific, like engineering, some industries have very specific language that is alien to them.
A great example here is Solvency II, where the regulator Solvency II came up with their own slightly different terms for data quality dimensions, and so you have to translate. And I think it's a bit like the United Nations, isn't it? We're always going to have to translate. The points I was making this morning was, you always have to translate from business language to IT language. You always have to translate from business language to data language. We're riddled with terminology.
Yeah, I agree with that.
To know what
I understand, and I understand there is a need for that, and it will happen because it's just the real world. I just think that, like, I picture a relay race. Now, when somebody's running with that baton and they're going from where they're going on 100 metres, they don't very often trip over and fall. But when they hand that baton over to the next guy and it gets translated, something gets lost. If you could run the full 400 metres with the same description and make it from beginning to end, then there's no gap for it to fall down. That would be my goal. It might be unrealistic. That would be my objective.
Gary, sorry.
Yeah, I was just thinking that what you need is a word which we all agree on amongst ourselves. I don't think it really matters about the business. Because all we were trying to do with the white paper in some ways was to form a foundation, a basis that said these are things in the data which can be measured. And it's become evident from some of the discussions here that there are a number of layers. There are certain things which can be measured within the data itself, not requiring outside assessment. And that's even as we were talking about, we moved from measures to assessments as we found it more and more difficult to say we could actually measure these things. So I think if we haven't got a term amongst ourselves we can agree on, but these are the things which can be empirically measured, these are the things where we have to take a subjective view, then we're going to find it very difficult to take that discussion further up the hierarchy to the difficult bits. This should be the easy bit, the best we can measure. It's as you get up into the more subjective pieces where you've got a reference to the real world and kind of make an assessment of whether you're getting close to representing it correctly or not.
Yeah. Okay. Right, Matthew.
I think we've actually got this the wrong way around. That we are discussing what word we should be using, and it's not obvious because the word is already in use regularly everywhere, is actually a measure of the maturity of data quality as a discipline and its acceptance within industry. And it doesn't matter, we could decide to use characteristic or dimension. Whatever we decided wouldn't actually make much difference. It might make a small difference, but one of these words is going to emerge over the next 10 years as the word that people have focused around. I've seen this happen in other areas. In the early 90s I was talking about reference data management. People now talk about master data management. I don't like it, but that's what people talk about, so it's fine. And something like that will happen with whatever dimensions, what we're calling dimensions here today is.
Yeah, okay.
As a data modeler, I'm always turning to dictionaries, and the dictionary in my head says that characteristic is a better word for this, into just the plain English meaning of it. Though I haven't got a dictionary in front of me, of course, I've just got one in here.
I think the danger of rebranding it, at the end of the day, it's a vehicle to communicate an idea. And I think if you look back at the history, data quality dimensions first came about in sort of I can't remember Redmond's first book. I mean, Redmond was probably the first book, and in his very first book, he was talking about data quality dimensions. And every single book that's been published, every major book, data quality dimensions have been sort of featured and covered. So I think there's a danger of just creating a new word or a new term that instinctively is going to alienate the audience that you've already got. People who've been doing this stuff for a decade, or people just getting started and they're reading the books by McGilvray and Maybe Chicken, Larry English, everything, to something completely new. Because I think we've been on a journey now since the 90s with data quality. I think there's a danger of creating something new when so many people understand this term. They can go into a book. For example, if we do a webinar, we talk about data quality dimensions and no one understands it. If they pick up their book that they bought from Lotion or whoever, they flip to the index, they found it. If they search for characteristic, they're going to get lost. So I understand the concern, but personally I just think it serves its purpose. It's a bridge between both worlds. But I
think I just need a new dictionary.
Well,
I'll upgrade this one.
Yeah,
it's the solid standard.
It's a dark dictionary, isn't it?
Right,
I suppose one concern I have, and it's sort of been said now, but in presentations that seem to be different, which was dimension seems to suggest that a particular rule can only fall into one category. And if you have a situation, for example, like completeness, there's two ways that you can check completeness if there's a finite number of entries in it. So you can check what are the valid values and everything else is therefore invalid. And that is similar in a way, or cater for the same check as an incomplete rule with checking for not null. Now, if both those rules both return the same thing, then you end up in a situation where a rule can apply to both categories and still have the same methodology to the rule.
Does that matter? I mean,
well, it does, I guess, categorise.
Well, I mean, it comes down to that thing, I guess, is that, in a way to me, data quality dimensions are a bit like in the enterprise architecture space, Tom Gilb's ilities. And you wouldn't go about talking about Gilb criteria to business. You use the ilities as a checklist to understand whether you've elicited out of the business in terms of the non-functional requirements, the right characteristics of the system and the solution you need to deliver. And I think dimensions are a similar kind of thing. To me, they're a way of elucidating through the requirements process whether you've got all the rules you should have for the data. And if you get the rule out by using the accuracy dimension or the completeness dimension, it shouldn't really matter. What should matter is you've got the right rules around your data.
But if you then present it as what is your completeness score or what is your validity score, then you're now translating a rule to a specific category.
Yeah,
so the opening dimension is only assigned to one.
It should be tested though, shouldn't it, in multiple? I mean, the only way I can picture dimensions in my head is like X, Y, Z ordinates going in different planes. Now that's absolutely fine, so I'm testing in this plane whether it's complete. I'm testing in this plane whether it's valid. If I combine those things or use them, they're mutually exclusive, they may well be combined. For me, accuracy, it has to be valid, it has to be the right values, it has to be the right representation. So there's multiple layers as we're talking about. So I don't think there's a problem there, and that's the only, these axes, if you like, of measurement kind of work for a dimension.
Are we looking at this the right way? Because the point that you brought up earlier, it's about adding value back to the business. So would you not look at the dimensions that are available in all the different toolkits and say, what out of this is going to add value to my business? Then choose what you're going to start to measure.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you can get very tangled up in the.
You contemplate the navel forever.
It really varies, like I said before, it varies on where you are in your life cycle. If you're doing a localised cleanup, and your job is just to clean your marketing database up because you want to do an annual marketing push for charity, so completeness is your main thing because you want to get as many emails populated as you can so you get the best return on your Christmas giving campaign or something like that.
It could be completely all wrong.
Yeah, as long as you've got email addresses, that's what you want. If you're an insurance company and you've got a Solvency II requirement, then you need auditability. It's a different type. It's consistency. You want consistency all the way through your actuarial databases. A telco, again, it's different. It's different in every industry and on the size of the project as well. You have to come out. The big mistake is to look at a profiling tool or SQL commands and then work back from that, trying to find problems in the business. You've got to start with what the business is trying to achieve first, and then pick out the rules that best represent what action you want the business to take.
And certainly what we've said in our white paper is that you don't necessarily use all six if it's not necessary.
I think the priorities will change as well as your data kind of evolves and goes through its life cycle. So, for instance, timeliness at the start of our projects, we just didn't even bother looking at it because it was such a low priority dimension compared to completeness, which was really, really low. Well, we'll get the completeness scores up first and then we'll look at timeliness when it's actually a problem.
I think, to your point there, is all of these really are an assessment and measure, whatever we're going to call it, of stuff that you've got. And one of the slides, unfortunately didn't come out correctly, but I pictured it a bit like looking at a tube map. So we can say, okay, I want to go to Waterloo. Where am I? So for me, these are assessments of where you are, like profiling. Now there's another odd name for something, but I profile my data, I understand my dimensions, I understand where I am, it's kind of rear view stuff, this is where I am. The important thing is, where do I want to go? How important is this to the business? And to your point, I think the critical thing is putting some assessment around it, like the risk model, that says, actually, that's the most important thing I need to attack first. And apply a bit of Pareto type thinking, right, I can do 20% here that's going to have 80% impact to the business, and I must do it in that sequence because that's what's important. I think that's really where we're going from this.
All feeds into what Tim was saying about requirements.
Totally. But if you can't measure against something, then you don't know where you are yet.
So, I personally, I think dimensions is a useful word, and I'm happy to use that as anything else. The question about addressing senior executives, well, you always have to tune the old language to the senior executives. Doesn't matter whether you're talking about data management or whatever you're talking about. You also mentioned about how you think these dimensions as being orthogonal to each other. Well, clearly the six that are mentioned in the first presentation are not orthogonal to each other. You can't have, if you've got uniqueness, then how can you have inconsistency? To take an example. They're not orthogonal to each other. They're measuring things that are relative. It seems to me that the right point is the one at the end. The purpose of describing these things is to create a checklist for us when we're reviewing against the requirements. So that you can go down and you can say, have I thought about completeness? Yes, I have. I've got completeness of that, I've got completeness of that. And the goal of this thing is to create a checklist that covers all of the important things. We've got a number of things that it seemed to me weren't covered by the 6 that were in there, like traceability, accessibility, there was another one as well, precision, which are important in my line of business. And I'd be, when I'm going to look through a list of dimensions, I want to see those because they're going to be important for me doing my tests. We need to think about what's the goal of doing this, and the goal of doing this surely is to help the people in this room. If you have to use different language and you're presenting to senior managers, well, so what? That's why they pay us the big bucks. Sorry, that was sarcasm.
I sort of switch between the business and IT with each job I do. As far as the business is concerned, whether you put characteristics or dimension, I don't think will mean anything to them. It's how you then describe it to them. If you say to me as a business person, it's a data dimension or a data characteristic, I wouldn't have a clue what you're talking about, other than it's something to do with it's attribute. I wouldn't know what you were talking about, whether it was, as we said, whether it's in kilograms or whether it's data type or whatever. So I think from the business perspective, you're going to have to go deeper anyway to explain what you're about and describing it. The other side of it, we talk about language. I mean, language is about how the term is used. So sort of being a bit new to data quality, the term data management has enabled me to sort of research it and look into it. So if you suddenly came along and had those data characteristics, you'd sort of go, if I was searching for that, I wouldn't necessarily find it so easily. I think the business is the same. If you give them a term and say, we're talking about data dimensions, this is about, if you want to actually look at it, there's loads of stuff on the internet, and they want on the internet. That's what they look for, and there's a load of stuff on there, so it really does help.
Yes, I mean, my worry, my reticence, one of the points I tried to make this morning was, if we're expending all this energy just debating whether to call a dimension or a characteristic, are we not debating ourselves into obscurity? Are there not much bigger problems that you have to go out and solve? I think data quality.
Absolutely. I think about just parking that one as an academic exercise and get on to understanding how you're going to define the rules that define completeness. But that's where it gets really, as you saw, that someone just saying, one of our followers this week, what completeness have you got on your email address for a telco? That is a massive challenge, just trying to understand that. Just that one completeness rule is so complex. So I think it would be good as we evolve this process is have some of these workshops where you bring people along who say, well, this is how I did it, and I had to use an ETL tool, I had to do this and that. This is how I did it, this is how I figured out trust. I did a survey, and we had to do workshops and things like that with our business users. I mean, a good example is, I think one of the things we're missing with a product yet is the fact that dimensions give you a fantastic comparative tool when you're starting out. Because one of the things I did with it was a utilities company. I just didn't know where to start. I was dropped in and I said, I was going to send out a survey and say, do you trust your data? I said to all the senior level managers, and instantly you could see where the hotspots were in the organisation. You didn't have to plug any software in, just by saying, do you trust your data? You could see that some of the engineering teams didn't trust it, but some of the marketing teams did. And it's like, where are you going to start with? You want to start with, so you can use it at different levels, but it's not just about sort of number crunching, it's about some of those other softer dimensions. They'll give you a really good start with. But the key thing is comparative. You need to build something that you can compare different divisions with and trend over time as well. And then you really want to be able to see, okay, if I'm improving completeness, what's the impact on the business? So 6 months we've been doing all this work, has the business changed? So you've got to integrate some of these KPIs with your dimensions as well.
Yeah. Questions? More questions? I could open the can of worms that I can wiki
Go for it.
One of the debates we've had amongst the working group that we've not satisfied, well, we've not got to a point where we all fully agree with each other. There are 2 camps, and that is, can you have accuracy without validity? Can you have validity without accuracy? So there's 2 camps. One is the view is, if the data isn't valid, it therefore must be inaccurate. I take a view, and a few others take the view that actually you can have data that doesn't conform to a valid format. It could be a date format that's incorrect. But if you look at that date, it is actually the right date for the event it's meant to describe. So I'm the camp that says You can have accuracy without validity. So let's have a talk to the panel and see what they think. It's good, this could go on for ages.
Might get the right now.
Yeah,
I don't know if this comes allowed, right?
I should be able to answer this quite easily because Julian raised this one with me probably in the first morning break, but I've probably changed my mind. It's 27 times since then. I've reviewed the paper and had a look at some of the definitions, and I think at the moment I think there's work to be done, and I think it's largely around the layering aspect that I tried to sort of draw attention to in what I said this morning. And so I think that to me, the validity dimension is something more at the implementation level. It's more about the representation. And again, if I look at what we've done in ISO 8000, it's where we're moving from the early stage requirements into actually creating a data specification. And Dylan made reference to Peter Benson. And in fact, so the diagrams that I showed, the case study I showed, is all the work that comes out of the work that Peter's done, which is around creating a data specification that's computer processable and being able to compare that with your data set. And essentially, if everything there is self-consistent in that closed world, then you tick a box. That's to me what I hear when we talk about the validity. The accuracy I see as being more this issue about what is this data set telling me about the real world. And to me, there's a whole set of processes and ultimately some sort of statistical approach that probably needs to sit around that. I can't remember, somebody I had a conversation with earlier about being responsible for sort of 10,000 address records or whatever. You know, as the database administrator for those 10,000 records, are you going to be the one that's going to go and knock on everybody's front door and ask them, you know, is this data record correct? Clearly, that's not going to happen. So I think accuracy is something more at maybe what we would call the information level, and validity is more at maybe a data level, something like that.
I think it depends what's kind of driving the requirement really. So what's the priority for the business stakeholders that you're looking at data quality for? So probably a good example. Recently we've been doing some work with an online retailer, and we looked at all their postcodes, and we were kind of demonstrating some defects that we found. And we said, well, you know, this percentage of your postcodes don't match the format. And they said, well, why do I care that we're not having goods going missing? They're still getting to our clients. And we kind of hadn't really thought about that. So saying, well, okay, the priority to them is getting the goods out to the clients. They're not really thinking, well, if these postcodes don't follow a format, then, you know, my BI tool might miss them out, and then my insights and my decision making is wrong. So I guess it depends what, you know, the priority is at that point in time, really.
I've got quite a few strong views on this. Putting a few glasses of wine to get them out. But essentially, I think it's one of the biggest problems we have with dimensions, because I see this with the authors. I interview a lot of the authors, and if you look at the accuracy dimension book, it basically clearly states you can figure out the accuracy dimension by doing all these different types of rules. If you read someone else like Redmond, it's like, no, it relates to reality. My take on it is, accuracy is, does it relate to reality or a surrogate source of reality that is trusted? The reason I say that is because, one classic example, we did a really intense national audit for telco, and we did every dimension you could think of, completeness and formatting and validity, all those different ones. And then at the very last minute we thought, well, we better check to see if it's accurate. Yeah, so we went on site, we found 30% of the equipment just wasn't where it's meant to be. So what was more important, that the racks were identified correctly or the equipment wasn't there. So accuracy was just, it trumped every other dimension out there. So for a business, I think accuracy is probably the most important dimension. But you can only, there's certain ways of doing it. Obviously, you've got to go out on site, or things, if a duck's under the ground and it's been there 100 years, you can't do it. So you have to look at other sources of information like connectivity and things like that. But it's interesting because I think when you look at validity, I think it's one of the easier dimensions to manage. I was looking at Matrix here, and it has attribute format, value values, precision constraints, optionality constraints. It's around the domain. Do those values conform to a domain? Is it yes or no? Is it all ASCII characters or whatever? So I think that's one of the best places to start. But what you've got to be careful is as you're improving that dimension, you will invariably create knock-on impacts with dimensions above it. So I think one of the things we have to do is figure out the hierarchy of how we apply these. As I showed before, you can clean some data up and get the format right, but boom, you create a uniqueness violation. So it's, accuracy is it there in the ground? That's the reality.
Well, the example we used was the date scenario that I presented, but you just mentioned postcodes. The postcode could be completely valid. It's a correct postcode, but it does not equate to the town, the county. So that's an issue. For me, it actually supports the presentation that Tim said, where it has to be valid by it's syntactically correct. It has to be the correct value, it's semantically correct, and it has to be the correct representation, which is a pragmatic representation. So I think it actually supports the ISO point of view.
I think, again, validity is a fairly simple measure, but accuracy can be very complex. With accuracy, you are largely relying on third-party data, and can you actually afford to buy that data or buy those tools that give you that accuracy? So I think you've got to think of the cost as well that's associated with getting accuracy. If it's critical that you do get accuracy, then you've got to then get some business case to justify that. And I think that's where maybe some companies would struggle.
I think also accuracy is, again, it's all down to the fitness of use, because there's almost a precision to accuracy. How accurate does something have to be? So we talked about postcodes. So I'm a delivery company, and somebody rings me up and says, okay, what's the cost of delivering this parcel from A to B? At that point they say, what's your postcode where you are? Where's it going? How much does it weigh? What size it is? It's good enough. That's accurate enough at that point in time. Okay, I now need you to deliver it. Okay, a whole load new information has to come up, what data. What time's it being collected? Who's it being collected from? Is it hazardous? Blah, 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 blah. Where's it going to? What are their opening hours? Da, 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 da. So they deliver it and they go, okay, next level. Where's it being invoiced? Who does it go to? What are the payment terms? So accuracy is very specific to the need, like anything else. So again, too subjective. I vote for it actually not being a dimension, but another dimension.
I think there's an irony to that, in that, going back to the word clouds I presented earlier, it was the one that comes across along with completeness as the most frequently occurring. I think it's front of anybody's thoughts, particularly probably also in a layman perspective as well. Yeah. You talk about data quality, the first thing they'll say is, so is my data accurate? But I think, once you think about the practicalities of measuring accuracy, then inevitably you hit all the things about completeness. And I'm going to use another phrase that we haven't used much, was standardization. So you might, in a scenario where you have an address, so I've got legacy systems that will hold addresses in their own slightly bespoke, funny way, but it's a valid way of holding the address detail for that system. If you want to compare that against a source of valid addresses, then arguably what you first have to do is standardise that address into a format that's directly compatible with, a UK address file or an Experian address check or whatever else it is you want to do at that point in time. So I don't think you can just go the format, or anything else of that data. It doesn't matter when we're talking about accuracy, I think, in the practical terms, because ultimately we're talking about machine comparison and not human semantic comparison, where you can deal with these inconsistencies. You have to face into the facts of it.
Please from the floor, Martin.
Sorry, what might be useful, I think, is just looking at what other disciplines and practices look at around these terms. So, there were a couple of you that used accuracy in conjunction with this idea of measurement. how accurately are you measuring something. Validity, on the other hand, it's used in the academic research sort of community as meaning something about if you're trying to encapsulate a phenomenon, are you capturing that phenomenon completely and validly? So it's much more of a judgment call rather than a measurement issue. If you look at the accounting financial discipline, they've got a very clear concept of validity as being authorized transactions, if you like. So I think the closer you can use your definitions to some of these pre-existing ideas of what these things mean in other areas, that might actually help. But for me, this idea of distinction on one hand about measurement and the other hand more of a judgment about what is a valid thing, be it format, be it, is this a fraudulent item or whatever.
Well, it might be sensible to actually qualify the term to make it clearer. So valid syntax might be what you really mean when you say validity.
Can have more than one validity at once.
Sorry.
In an international system, or postcode, you could have more than one valid syntax at once.
Sorry, gentleman back up.
Just want to mention that he was talking about some business process management, and he will, when he mentioned the process of, for example, sending a post from A to B, he did talk about the stages actually to process, for example, a parcel movement from this postcode to maybe another where the delivery is. And that's called the business process management. And I think accuracy of data comes from the business process. So the business process validate the stages and actually make the accuracy of data. And data actually go through the business process from A to B. That's what's my view. I think there is a link between business management process and data processing.
Can I ask a question, just to something I've been pondering over? 10% of all Facebook accounts are bogus. Facebook data. If you were looking at social media as a source of information on your customers, is that 10% of data accurate?
Interesting point. But if it's a reference data set, presumably, if they're bogus, you'd have to have that bogus entry in the database to correlate with that entry. If you've got the real world entity then in your database, you wouldn't be able to reference that.
But the real world entity is the Facebook account.
The real world entity surely is the person.
Yes, the person.
No, the real world entity is the Facebook account.
But doesn't that come down to the point about when if somebody is selling or providing reference data, they have to give its provenance?
They make that up.
Right, okay.
I haven't heard about data quality dimensions.
I think the other thing that begins to refer back to is some of the discussion we had about, so the point that came from over here earlier in the day, about whether we properly qualify the uncertainty in our data, and that again I was sort of thinking about that as the rest of the panel talked about the accuracy point, because it is then related to precision in the sense of actually, for those of us that come from more of an engineering or science background, we're used to giving a sense of the range of values that we might be referring to when we talk about the property of a material or whatever. We'll have done some sort of experiment and we'll have done sort of assessment of the inherent experimental accuracy. And it gets expressed as a tolerance. So I think that that's probably a level of sophistication and maturity that we've hinted at a little bit today, but probably is another one of these emerging things that we've probably still not got our minds around fully. And in the case you give, if we're going to get, if we believe there's something useful that we're going to discover by using the social media, we may well then need to qualify it by that associated known issue that 10% of the accounts are fraudulent, but it's still giving us a sense of a trend or something that we can still use usefully.
So, as I said, I work in the oil industry. The one thing we know about all subsurface data in the oil industry is it's wrong. We just don't know how it's wrong yet. So I would agree, accuracy, throw it away, it's not useful.
You could have a career in marketing, because in marketing 50% of the data is right, or works, we just don't know much about.
I'm interested in the analysis part of looking at the data that you have and the idea that it's been inputted by people who are actually doing their best, but inaccurately, but that perhaps when you're analysing it you notice patterns that they've been putting things in that you think are not valid, but maybe it's the only place they can put it in, and how that comes up in the analysis, how you can actually use that. Does that make any sense? To make it better for the business.
Well, I think that builds on my point about the data can be in invalid format, but it's actually still not the right representation of the real world entity it describes. So clearly I think it depends on the circumstance we're talking about as to whether it is allowable to be invalid and still not accurate. Certain things that will use the practice, as in your bank account, for example, are not accurate. It's about ownership of a property or a physical asset, then it probably does help. So it depends on the course of the base. Any thoughts?
Yeah, you have 100% completeness, but if you have a mandatory field in a system, then they could be putting any old rubbish. There's perhaps a drop-down menu, and they're just picking the first one. So in that respect, you do need to look at the patterns of the data to understand. Well, okay, yeah, fine, it's 100% complete, but you do need to look at other dimensions like validity to understand, well, what's perhaps the patterns that are associated with that. Are they expected patterns as well? So going back to the business, would you expect X amount to be this value? Yeah, so again, consistency.
I've seen scenarios where business users have decided to repurpose fields. Unused address lines, defunct addresses, and just repurposed. And I think it kind of underlies that, if you were just analysing that data, you'd go, what on earth is this? It didn't have any obvious meaning. And you need that business knowledge, you need that context.
That's true of the that's absolutely true of the business, and it's absolutely true of IT as well, where they overload a field for the secondary use, which causes problems, as we know. I think, sorry, so the gentleman in the cap, I think that the latest point there is almost a process issue, isn't it? I think the data doesn't lie. The data gives you the truth of what's happening in the process. And that the whole purpose and the whole idea of the ISO is to prevent, where possible, defects in the data, and you're learning from that in order to be preventative where you can. I think that in reality, being pragmatic, we will never stop every defect getting into data. I think what we can do is automate the process as far as possible. We have to humanise the exception.
I think one of the things we have to be careful with is, I hate to say this, I know it's going to the difference between data and information. And if you've ever been on LinkedIn, those discussions can run for about 3 or 4 years, so I'm not going to go into it. But the whole point is, getting resources for courses. I've done a lot of data migrations, for example, where the data in an old legacy engineering system is accurate, complete, valid. Yeah, because it'll say, Fred has put the rack next to the fire hydrant on the 3rd floor. That's absolutely fine. For an engineer's purpose, that's exactly what they need. Which building to go and where to do the power change, the battery change. But when you're migrating to one of these Cradle called multi-million-pound systems where they want a GPS coordinate for that rack, so they can work out the best engineer to send in the quickest time, it is not complete, it's not valid, it's not. The data is one type of dimension. You've got to think about the information, and that's when you have the context. So you've got to be so careful when you're presenting these metrics back, these dimensions back. You have to change the context, depending on which group you're talking to.
Do we need a uselessness dimension?
Based on experience at Telco, usually it'll be the first one you it's the context that trips you up every time. So that discussion we've had this week with the guys, what is your completeness on email addresses in Telco? And so many people are responding, but the whole point is it's irrelevant. That answer is really irrelevant.
A better question is how many bounce?
Is it for marketing or is it for legislation? Is it for data protection? You've got to be really careful with the context.
Actually, I think that's a very important point. We as professionals should ask better questions.
Okay, I think we have to draw to close there. I'm just mindful of the time that we're sort of starting to overrun very, very slightly.